All right. Any questions, comments, concerns, anything during the lunch break that seems to be sitting around? No? Okay, and we're going to go. So, tension or resistance? The point is that there are some things that there is going to be a certain amount of, resistance to or tension to, and that it's not going to change. It has to be there. It's kind of like making sure that people don't eat things they're not supposed to eat, or that they're not taking medicine they're not supposed to take, or that they do take the medicine when they're supposed to take it. There's some things that you're not going to be able to change, but you can address other things that can mitigate the overall stress levels, or you can take something that somebody is good at, or something they really value, something that's high importance to them, and use that to offset some of these other things. So in this picture here, we have a young child who obviously is highly curious, right? Can we find another way for that child to experience curiosity? Sure. Can we find another way for that child to experiment with electricity? Sure. So it's not that you can't do those things. It's not no, it's how. Okay? So it's just a matter of thinking about how do you make it. Absolutely. So it really is just a matter of thinking about how do you make something a viable alternative. So long story short, not a good thing. There are some things in life that are always going to have a degree of tension or resistance. You want to try and build up the things that they're good at, that they like doing, that they value, so that you can bring over the overall stress levels down. And then the other part of it is, can you dissect the behavior and say, okay, you can do this part of it. You can experience curiosity in a different way. You can experiment with electricity in a different way. But that way is not a good way to experiment with electricity. So that's the bottom line. All right? So let's take a look at your color version that you've got in front of you. And we want to just point out the data points, and you can see that we've got them. We went ahead and did the coloring. All right, so all the 9s and 10s I put in red. So you can see that those are things that we have to pay attention to. 8s, 9s, and 10s are in red. Okay, so then the next part of this is where I go back through and I start coloring. So I color, all the things that are above what number? Get green? Do you remember? Have to be discussed? No? 35. Anything above 35 has to be in green. Anything above 49 is yellow. Got to do something with that. And then anything above 63, big time problems. Can we agree? Okay. So that's the first part. We did that for him. Then we go over here and do the same kind of coloration on the numbering system for the system of supports, and then do the coloration over here. All right. So in a couple minutes we're going to talk about the critical issues, but so far on the motivation, tension, and resistance on the factor side for the person, what are the things that kind of jump out at you on the motivation, tension, resistance factoring score? Anything hit you real big? Just the person's side of the assessment at this point.
You mean the 90?
Yeah. Yeah.
70, 72?
A 90, a 70, and a 72. If that 72 is a big number, I guarantee you that 72 is a big number.
Yeah.
Okay? So yeah, you're talking some pretty significant things that this person is telling you. And the fact that there's not just one, but 3, okay, that's a strong warning. Okay? Not at all dissimilar from the person that we did the assessment on. When we were looking at him, I was scared when the numbers came out. I was like, oh my gosh, we got to do something right now. So that's the reality. Jen, would you mind I'm wanting you to tell the home audience who's seeing this on video what the life of that person was before, kind of a real brief, how bad this was, and do where she's at now. The reason for this is that we have found that the single best thing that you can do with this kind of stuff is to use it to encourage other people. And this is really an important part of it. So, Jen, would you just...
All right, well, just briefly, the young woman that we had mentioned a couple times already was living in a behavioral group home. She was very secluded. It was very difficult to get her out into the community at all. A lot of self-mutilation. She would often just bite chunks out of her skin and spit it. She was nonverbal overall. She had her own form of sign language. And it was very difficult to get to a point where staff could communicate with her and she could communicate with staff in a way that she was comfortable with. There seemed to be a lot of anger and anxiety, and we just weren't sure, because of the communication barriers, you know, how to serve her best, how to help her. And we ran into a lot of roadblocks along the way. It was very, very sad. She was sleeping almost all day. Anytime someone wasn't directly next to her within a couple of, inches of her body, she just would lay down on the couch and go to sleep. So it was sleep, or it was screaming and yelling and hurting herself almost all day. That was pretty much her life.
And now?
And now she was able to move out of the group home that we had her in. She transitioned into an individualized supported living unit, which is not a unit at all, it's an apartment, with a couple other ladies. There aren't all of the restrictions and rules that the behavioral group home has. She's engaging in activities on her own for up to a couple of minutes a day, which is huge for her. I mean,
that's huge.
Yeah, it was not existent before. And she's laughing a lot. So she's awake throughout the day most of the time. So that's good.
Well, that's excellent. And see, that is a perfect example of the kinds of outcomes that can be available. It's like the folks in Kentucky and in Brookwood and several other places, that those little vignettes of the before and afters make all the difference in the world. Because sometimes when you see an assessment like this, you just go, oh, come on. It's a whole lot of work. Well, it's not, first of all, it's not a whole lot of work. It does take you some time to sit down and think it through. The hardest part is actually making sure that you understand what the individual is saying. And I think that was one of the things she had going for her, was she had a bunch of people who really cared about her and were committed to trying to figure out how to support her as opposed to get her to be gone, which is the way things a lot of times play out. So really, okay, excellent. Thank you, Jen. I appreciate it. But I don't usually make a big deal out of total scores. Don't spend a lot of time talking about it because we don't have any research behind it at this point. We haven't looked at, what does it mean, if anything. But I will tell you that when you've got, when I see a number that's at the 500s level, that's pretty high. And so overall, this person is saying, even though we've got some really low scores, the 3 and the 1 and the 8, you'd think the 6, you'd think those would offset, the really high numbers, but, when you've got 72s, 70s, 60s, 90s, 50s, those are high enough to really jack the score. Okay, so that's pretty big. Now the other side is that we've got the system is telling us here, if you look, we have a fair degree of congruence in terms of things that they think are important. You notice 10, 10, 10, 8, 8, 10, 10, 9, 10. So you've got a fair amount of congruence between what people think is important, but only a degree of agreement in terms of what the barriers look like. Okay? So we have some disagreements about what the barriers look like. So the system is saying there's some pretty major barriers, even though these things are important. We're dealing with a lot of high-end barriers, okay? So now you look down here, you got her number at 524, and I said that was kind of scary. And then you look over at the system's score, and you've got 824. Well, what that basically saying is that even though your life already sucks, I'm about to make it worse. So I'm going to push on you to do stuff you don't want to do. I'm going to be dragging you to go places you don't want to go. And I'm not saying that in a pejorative or mean or that staff are awful or anything like that. I'm saying that this is telling us that they're trying to get this person to do, they're trying to get Michael to do a lot of stuff Michael don't want to do. And Michael's having a hard time with it. Michael, by the way, this is a real person. He happens to live in Hawaii. But he's another one of those people who went from, and Michael has no overt language. I mean, and like you talk to him and he kind of looks at you like, I see that you're talking to me and I appreciate that you're talking to me, but I have not a clue what you're saying. But a lot of other people really cared about him, and they did the as if they were Michael. Carl Rogers, the as if condition, and they just role played that they were Michael. And we had them each role play that they were Michael separately, and then brought them together and did the work. All right, so we see again, if we saw a 90 and a 70 and a 72 over there and said, wow, those are pretty high numbers. What are we seeing over here on the system side, under the motivation, tension, resistance factor for the system side? 90, 100, 90, 70, 80, 70, 70, okay? So the reality is that we're saying is that we've got basically we got 1, 2, 3, 4 areas that somehow didn't qualify as being critical from the system standpoint. Does that make sense? So they're really working hard to try and help this person change or become, but we've got some major problems now too, don't we? Okay? So purple is tension or resistance? Who can tell me? Okay? Yep. Okay? So, we've got them trying to get him to do something over here, so they want him to be able to help others. And he's saying, I don't care anything about helping others. So he's resisting. So, and then, let's go down to vengeance. Okay? So, data point on vengeance. And we've got a 50. 50's like really big. Okay, that's like huge. It's almost impossible to score that high. Except for when you look at him saying vengeance and retaliation and getting back at, Michael wanted his space, his way, all the time, and he wanted it to be wherever he wanted it. So if it was there one day, but he moved it over here the next day and it was in somebody else's space, didn't matter. And if they messed up his stuff and tried to push it out of the way, then Michael would beat the living tar out of them. Because it was about vengeance and retaliation, and then he would put his desk right back where he wanted it. So, you understand that this is a non-negotiable, okay? And the reality is that most of the people who were pretending to be Michael didn't really perceive there to be many barriers, because by the time he would decide that he was going to aggress on somebody, it was already pretty much too late. You know, he'd already, typically done it. And they didn't know how to not have him do those things, except by restraint, which they're a restraint-free program. So they were feeling stuck. Does that make sense? So you come over here, and they're going, okay, look, it is not important for him to have vengeance. We want him to have vengeance go away. We want him to not have any vengeance. And from our perspective, we wish there were a 10 in the barriers category, but there's not. because they felt like their hands were tied because they didn't know what to do. So you understand how that became a 1 on their side? They didn't perceive that there were barriers to him demonstrating vengeance. So 50, big time problem now, don't we? Okay, so we've got some serious tension going on between something he wants and something they don't want to give. Does that make sense? All right, now, let me show you how you count the data points. This is really easy, guys. Okay? Again, please don't complicate it. If it's an 8, a 9, or a 10, it counts. 1, 2, 3. If it's above any of those thresholds, it counts. 4. If it's in the range of 0.5, or below, or 5 and above, it gets counted. So that's, and now we got 5. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You see it? That's how you do data points. That's simple. Why do you do data points? Because you've got a whole lot of numbers, okay? And you're going to have to figure out which ones you're going to pay attention to. And you've got to do some kind of prioritization, okay? So, one of the things we start doing, we start paying attention to is, if we've got a whole bunch of data points that we've got in agreement, then we want to start paying attention to those probably first, okay? And so then the other part that we're going to pay attention to is, are any of these in the threshold areas, okay, that are not being covered by the data points? So do we have something that is, at a threshold level that we need to be addressing, but for whatever reason wasn't high on the data point side, okay? So you may have fewer data points, but still have something that's really important. So like, look here. You got this one as a perfect example. You got 1 data point, 2 data points, 3 data points. 3 is a whole lot lower than the 6, right? So theoretically, it wouldn't have been prioritized. Okay? Except that it's a huge deal when it comes to the tension issues. Does that make sense? Okay? So using the data points helps you begin the process of prioritizing. It doesn't end the process of prioritizing. So you want to pay attention to those kinds of things, and you also want to make sure, and I'll use this as an example, we've only got 1 data point, all right? And it's a 0.33, that's below 0.5. So theoretically, worth paying attention to, right? Okay, well, except that this is below the threshold, all of those are below the threshold, this is below the threshold, and he's basically saying, it is unimportant, okay, scored it a 3, it's unimportant, and 2, I don't see, any real barriers. So what we're saying is that it's not important to him, it's not important to the system, so it doesn't matter what that score is. Does that make sense? There's times when you can say that score, in and of itself, isn't helpful. Okay? But we do know, to be honest with you, that that category of physical pain avoidance and seeking comfort is not something we're going to have to pay attention to for life. Just not. Not something he cares about. It's not something that's a problem for us. And that even though that theoretically it showed up as a resistance point, it's not enough to worry about. Okay? So you want to start looking at the thinking of what is it that we're trying to accomplish with these numbers. All right? Any questions about that part of it? You all good? All right. So how can we do this? We can identify some problem areas, right? And we've done that. And we can begin identifying potential solutions, because if you see the things that are highly important to that person, now you can start figuring out how can we use these things that are highly important to somebody to develop something else that they need to have. All right, so somebody who's really high on the anxiety side of things, they're really maxing out, but curiosity is real high for them. Okay, so how can we do something there? How about maybe we'll do some social skills and some relaxation training, and we will practice it in a social context and let him experiment and see how other people react to him being calm. See how other people react to him when he's engaged. So you're building on the curiosity and the social elements, because that's something that he's good at or cares about and is important to him, to help manage something else. Okay? So that's what it means by helping to begin to find those solutions. All right, so we want to reduce unnecessary tension and resistance. Are there places where we've got tension and resistance issues? Don't need to be there. We're making a big deal out of nothing. Okay? Mountains out of molehills, you know, and we're just struggling and causing all kinds of hassles that don't need to be there. So you want to build on the strengths and the interests. And the strengths are things that necessarily aren't going to show up on here. They're just things you know about the person. Okay? Just because it's not a fundamental motivator doesn't mean they don't know how to do it. It's like, you know, I'm pretty decent at art, but it would be hard to find where art shows up on that one, you know, on this assessment. Does that make sense? All right. And then you can also begin talking about, just like with the kid and the knife going into the socket, you begin negotiating alternatives. So it's not that it's bad to investigate. It's not that it's bad to want to find out how electricity works. It's not good to go flying across the room with a knife in your hand and a scorch mark on your hand and blowing all the fuses in the house or any of those other things. So that's when you begin negotiating the alternatives to, that's a decent thing to try and do. Let's figure out how we can do it with you together so that you don't have that problem. Okay? So that's an example of negotiating an alternative. If mom knew the baby's coming unglued and is going to scream and holler and throw a fit, and you know, going to the grocery store is going to be a real pain in the butt, then maybe it's a better thing to negotiate an alternative. And we'll calm the situation down first, let the baby chill, everybody gets calm, maybe take a nap, and go to the grocery store an hour or two later. Because it's the same kind of thinking, okay? Doesn't mean that we don't have to still go through the process of, or that we don't have to do things that need to be done, but sometimes how we go about doing it is as important as anything else, okay? So, we're going to practice on Michael. You've got his scores in front of you. What I want you to do is to come up with what are the most important things to Michael, what are the most urgent areas to address out of those things to Michael. So we'll start there. And we can pause the recording for just a couple seconds. All right, so who's going to tell me, what do you think are the most important things to Michael? Jen, go ahead.
Vengeance, order, independence, attention.
Yeah, those are the most important. And then curiosity and anxiety and calmness are running right in tight close behind, right? So those are the things that he's saying are the most important to him. What are the things that are most urgent for us to address for Michael? According to just using Michael's side of the scores at this point.
Order and anxiety.
Okay? So you said order and anxiety. And the reason you said order was because we had a 10 times a 9 equals a 90. That would seem to be very important. And anxiety, avoidance, and calmness, 8 times 9 is 72. Those happen to be the two highest scores on the motivation, tension, and resistance, which is how we figured in where the barriers were, where the problems are in getting those things. So,
Vengeance, though, would be pretty high just because of the safety factor that everybody.
okay, and it's scored high enough for us to say we have to do something about it in the plan. And yes, it is a matter in our head of vengeance being a risk factor, okay? So from our standpoint, we're looking at it a different way. But just from Michael's perspective only, Michael's saying, yeah, I mean, I want to beat the crap out of more people. And, and you guys keep trying to stop me. And I'm not liking it. Do you understand? Okay? So strictly from Michael's perspective, obviously the top three then are order, anxiety avoidance, and then attention. Ooh, attention. Now, here's a high need where we can actually perhaps use it for our advantage. Because we could give somebody a whole lot of attention for not hitting somebody else. You understand? Or I start engaging you and providing you with a lot of reward and valued presence kinds of experience. And maybe use that as a part of a way to get him to engage in relaxation. One of the activities that we used for Michael was to teach him how to blow up balloons. And then we made a big deal out of the fact that he had balloon bouquets. You understand? So he's blowing up balloons. He doesn't realize it's calming him down. But he's basically doing deep breathing 5 or 6 times in a day and making a balloon bouquet that he gets to give to somebody at the end of the day and walk around and hand it to the person that he likes, and then they take a picture with them and they make a big deal out of it. So, do you understand how you can use a high need even to support another high area of need? Okay. All right. So we've got that one. Now, what does the system of supports say? We're not going to shut the camera off this time. We're going to do it quicker. What does the system of supports think is the most important, single most important thing for Michael? Independent self-determination, because that scored 100, okay? What are the top 4 or 5 that they think is the system of supports think is most important? Order. Curiosity. Morality.
Frustration, avoidance, anxiety, avoidance.
Okay, anxiety, frustration, avoidance, all that kind of the emotional component stuff, okay? So you see how we got the goals and the sensitivities. And we've got some real issues here. And the system's saying we got a lot of stuff going on, okay? So now, according to this, we just said that these are the most important things that that we have to address, right? Because we use the motivation, tension, and resistance column to tell us what is most important for Michael. See, at this point, that question of what is most important for Michael and what is most important to address are the same question. Does that make sense? Okay? They're the same question. It's just asked a different way. So, what are the places that we have the most resistance? We have the most resistance where the system wants him to do something he don't want to do. Morality. And that's a 0.04. So that's pretty low, which means it's really high resistance. Okay? What else?
Vengeance.
Oh, you got vengeance again. Except that vengeance is a tension item, not a resistance item. Okay? Sexual gratification is identified, romance and sexual identification, romance and sexual gratification is a very high resistance number, okay, because it's 0.06. Now, does that mean that it's urgent to address? It's not important, okay? So, yes, it's a high, you absolutely got the right answer. Okay, it's the second lowest number, which makes it the second worst in terms of resistance. But if you look at his overall scores, not a big deal, right? Can we all agree? All right. So, what's after that one? Anybody got a guess?
Curiosity.
Curiosity. And curiosity is 0.3. Okay. Actually, I was going to go with physical activity at 0.19. Which is a little bit lower, and helping others is 0.20. But let's go back up to curiosity. Now look at the difference between the 0.19 that is associated with physical activity. There's only 2 data points, right? Okay. Now go up to the other one with curiosity, and we're at 0.30, but how many data points does it have? It's got 5. Do you see how, even though it's a bigger number, Because of the data points, it starts skewing it up in terms of how important it is to deal with. But it's still, okay, so we have several points on here that are major resistance issues, right?